Five teenagers. One night. A confession that would destroy their lives. This is the story of how America's justice system failed spectacularly, how innocent boys became convicted criminals, and how the truth stayed buried for over a decade. Welcome to the Central Park 5 story, the night that changed everything. To understand what happened on April 19, 1989, you need to understand New York City in the late 1980s. This wasn't the sanitized, tourist-friendly Manhattan you see today. This was a city gripped by fear. Crime rates were at an all-time high. The crack epidemic had devastated communities. Murders exceeded 2,000 per year. Central Park, that iconic green space in the heart of Manhattan, had become a symbol of urban decay. After dark, it was considered dangerous territory. The media fed this fear relentlessly. News broadcasts opened with crime statistics. Newspapers ran headlines about urban warfare and wilding, a term that would soon take on sinister significance. There was a palpable sense that the city was spiraling out of control. And into this volatile environment walked five teenagers who had no idea their lives were about to change forever. Antron McCray was 15 years old, a quiet kid from Harlem who loved spending time with his father. He was a homebody, not the type to get into trouble. Kevin Richardson was 14. He played the trumpet, loved music, and was close with his family. His sister Stephanie would later describe him as gentle and kind-hearted. Yusef Salaam was 15. Tall for his age, artistic, and deeply influenced by his mother's activism and spirituality. He wrote poetry and dreamed of a future beyond his Harlem neighborhood. Raymond Santana was 14. Small, energetic, with a quick smile. He lived with his grandmother and stayed out of trouble, focusing on school and friends. Korey Wise was 16, the oldest of the group. He had learning disabilities and struggled in school, but he was fiercely loyal to his friends. He wasn't even supposed to be in Central Park that night. He only went to keep his friend Yusef company. These weren't hardened criminals. They were children, middle school and high school students who lived in Harlem, who had families that loved them, who had dreams and futures stretching ahead of them. On April 19, 1989, it was an unusually warm spring evening. School was out. Kids throughout Harlem were restless, looking for something to do. A group of about 30 teenagers, including our five, decided to go to Central Park. Now, let us be clear about something important. Some kids in this larger group did commit crimes that night. There were reports of harassment. A man was assaulted. Bicyclists were bothered. This behavior was wrong, inexcusable, and several kids who participated should have faced consequences. But Antron, Kevin, Yusef, Raymond, and Korey were not meaningfully involved in these incidents. Some weren't there when they happened. Others were present but didn't participate. This distinction would become critically important, but in the chaos of what was about to unfold, these details would be completely ignored. While this group of teenagers was in the park, something horrific was happening in a different section entirely. Trisha Maley was a 28-year-old investment banker. Intelligent, athletic, and ambitious, she worked long hours at Salomon Brothers on Wall Street. Her evening routine included jogging through Central Park, even after dark. On April 19th, she went for her usual run around 9 p.m. What happened to her was brutal beyond description. Trisha was attacked near the 102nd Street Cross Drive, dragged into a ravine about 300 feet from the road, beaten savagely with a rock and other weapons, sexually assaulted, and left for dead in the mud. She lost nearly 80% of her blood. Her skull was fractured in multiple places. Her body temperature had dropped to 84 degrees when she was found. A passerby discovered her around 1:30 a.m., more than 4 hours after the attack. She was barely alive. Doctors at Metropolitan Hospital didn't expect her to survive. She was in a coma for 12 days. When she finally woke up, she had no memory of the attack. To this day, she has no recollection of what happened to her that night. The brutality of this crime shocked even a city hardened by violence. This wasn't a mugging gone wrong or a drug-related incident. This was random, savage violence against an innocent woman who was simply exercising. The media descended immediately. By the next morning, news helicopters circled Central Park. Reporters camped outside the hospital. The story dominated every news broadcast, every newspaper front page. The New York Post ran the headline, "Wolfpack's Prey." The Daily News called it wilding. These terms, loaded with racial coding, painted a picture of savage, animalistic violence. The fact that the victim was white and the suspected attackers were Black and Latino teenagers added a combustible racial element that the media exploited relentlessly. The pressure on the New York Police Department was immense. The mayor demanded answers. The media demanded justice. The public demanded blood. And the NYPD, under enormous pressure to solve this case immediately, needed suspects. Remember those teenagers who were in the park that night? The police began rounding them up. It started with the kids who had actually committed the earlier assaults and harassment. Officers took them in for questioning. But investigators weren't just interested in those incidents. They were laser-focused on the attack on Trisha Maley. The problem was, they had virtually no physical evidence connecting anyone to that crime. No witnesses. No clear suspects. Just a brutal attack and tremendous pressure to make arrests. So they cast a wide net. On April 20th, the day after the attack, police began bringing in teenagers from the Harlem neighborhood. If you were in or near Central Park that night, you were a potential suspect. The fact that the park was large and these kids had been in completely different areas didn't seem to matter. Raymond Santana was picked up early. His father had actually called the police after hearing news reports, wanting to clear his son's name since Raymond had been in the park. This decision would prove catastrophic. Antron McCray was brought in with his father, Bobby McCray, who was himself a city employee and believed cooperating with police was the right thing to do. Kevin Richardson went to the precinct with his mother, also believing that cooperation would quickly clear up any misunderstanding. Yusef Salaam was picked up from his home. Korey Wise, remember, wasn't even a suspect initially. He went to the precinct to support Yusef, his friend. The police decided to question him too. These teenagers and their families walked into the Central Park precinct believing in the justice system. They thought the truth would protect them. They had no idea what was about to happen. What happened over the next 14 to 30 hours would become one of the most controversial interrogations in American legal history. Let's establish the facts. These were minors. Under New York law at the time, juveniles had the right to have a parent or guardian present during questioning. Some parents were present for portions of the interrogation, but not always, and not consistently. The boys were also entitled to attorneys, but none were provided, and when families asked for lawyers, they were discouraged or told it would make things worse. The interrogations went on for hours, not 1 or 2 hours. We're talking 14, 20, 28 hours in some cases. The boys were exhausted, hungry, scared. Some had been awake for more than a day. And here's where it gets dark. The detectives used tactics that are now widely recognized as coercive and likely to produce false confessions, especially from juveniles. They lied, which was legal. They told the boys that their friends had already confessed and implicated them. They said they had evidence, fingerprints, witnesses, DNA, that proved their guilt. None of this was true, but the teenagers didn't know that. They made promises. Tell us what happened, and you can go home. Cooperate, and this will be easier for you. We know you didn't hurt her badly. Just tell us you were there, and we can sort this out. They created a narrative and then pressured the boys to confirm it. The detectives already knew what happened. They just needed the boys to say it. When details didn't match, they were corrected and adjusted until the story fit. They isolated the teenagers, separated from parents for long stretches, alone with adult authority figures in positions of power, in an unfamiliar and intimidating environment. They used fear and exhaustion as weapons. By the time these kids were making statements, they'd been worn down psychologically. They weren't thinking clearly. They just wanted the nightmare to end. And after hours of this treatment, the unthinkable happened. The boys began to tell the police what they wanted to hear. The so-called confessions were captured on videotape. These tapes would become the prosecution's most powerful evidence, and they're chilling to watch, but not for the reasons prosecutors claimed. Antron McCray's videotaped statement shows a terrified teenager, his father sitting next to him, telling a story that sounds rehearsed and uncertain. He describes being in the park, seeing a woman, and participating in an attack. But listen carefully. His details are vague, constantly shifting, and he looks to his father and the detectives for confirmation as he speaks. This isn't a confession. It's a performance by a child who's been told what to say. Kevin Richardson's video shows similar patterns. He's 14 years old, small for his age, clearly exhausted and confused. His statement contradicts the other confessions in key details. He places himself at the scene but minimizes his involvement, saying he only grabbed her leg when pressed by detectives. Yusef Salaam refused to sign a written confession, showing remarkable courage for a 15-year-old. But police claimed he made oral admissions. Without video or written documentation of these alleged admissions, it was the detective's word against the black teenagers. Raymond Santana's confession is heartbreaking. He's so young, so scared. He admits to being present, but describes events that don't match the physical evidence or the other confessions. Like the others, his statement is riddled with inconsistencies and prompted answers. Korey Wise's interrogation was the longest and most brutal. Korey had learning disabilities that made him particularly vulnerable to manipulation. His videotaped statements show him trying desperately to please the detectives, agreeing with their suggestions, changing his story when told he's wrong. At one point, he describes hitting the victim with a brick, but the medical evidence showed she was hit with a rock, and there was no brick at the scene. He got the location wrong. He got the timeline wrong. He got nearly everything wrong because he wasn't there, and he was making up details based on what the detectives told him. Here's the thing about these confessions. Not one of them accurately described the crime scene. None of them could tell police where Trisha's belongings were found. Their descriptions of her injuries were wrong. Their timeline was impossible. The details about the weapon were incorrect. Most damningly, not one of these confessions matched the others in any meaningful way. If 5 people witnessed and participated in the same crime, their accounts should align on basic facts. These didn't. Each boy told a different story, placing different people in different roles at different times. Any experienced detective should have recognized these as false confessions. The inconsistencies were glaring. But the NYPD wasn't interested in inconsistencies. They had their suspects. They had confessions on tape. They had intense public pressure demanding justice. Case closed. When news broke that 5 teenagers had confessed to the Central Park jogger attack, the city erupted. The media went into overdrive. These weren't just suspects anymore. They were monsters. The same newspapers that had used terms like wolf pack and wilding now had names and faces to attach to their narrative. Photos of the boys, and they were boys, children, were plastered across front pages. Not the innocent school pictures their families provided, but mugshots, booking photos, images carefully selected to make them look as threatening as possible. The coverage was viciously racist, though mainstream outlets would deny it. These were inner-city kids, troubled youth from broken homes. The subtext was clear. This was what happened when Black and Latino teenagers were allowed to roam free in civilized spaces like Central Park. Columnists called for the death penalty, conveniently ignoring that New York didn't have capital punishment at the time and that these were minors. Public figures lined up to condemn them. Donald Trump, then a New York real estate developer, took out full-page ads in multiple newspapers calling for the return of the death penalty. The ads, which cost $85,000, didn't mention the Central Park Five by name, but made clear who they were targeting. Bring back the death penalty. Bring back our police. The boys' families were devastated. Overnight, their sons went from being normal teenagers to being the most hated people in New York City. They received death threats. They couldn't go outside without harassment. Their lives were destroyed before any trial even began. The boys themselves were held at Rikers Island, New York's notorious jail complex. They were minors, but they were charged as adults for some counts. Korey Wise, being 16, was placed in the adult facility. The others were in juvenile detention, but the psychological impact was enormous. They were separated from their families, their schools, their normal lives. They were facing decades in prison for a crime they didn't commit. And they were still children, trying to understand how telling the police what they wanted to hear had led to this nightmare. Their lawyers tried to challenge the confessions, arguing they were coerced. They pointed out the inconsistencies, the impossibilities, the lack of physical evidence. But in the court of public opinion, the case was already decided. Here is something that should have stopped this prosecution in its tracks. There was virtually no physical evidence connecting these 5 boys to the crime. Let's examine what the crime scene revealed. Trisha Maley had been brutally beaten and sexually assaulted. This wasn't a clean crime. There was blood everywhere, evidence of a prolonged struggle, intimate contact between the attacker and the victim. In such a violent assault, you'd expect to find DNA from the perpetrator on the victim's body, fibers from the perpetrator's clothing, scratches, skin cells under the victim's fingernails, blood from the perpetrator if the victim fought back, hair evidence. Fingerprints on any objects used in the attack. Now, Let's look at what forensic analysis actually found connecting the Central Park Five to this crime. Nothing. Not a single DNA match to any of the five boys. Not on Trisha's body, not on her clothing, not anywhere at the crime scene. No fiber evidence connecting them to the crime. No hair evidence. No fingerprints. No blood matches. No scratches on the boys consistent with a victim fighting back. Actually, that's not quite accurate. There was DNA evidence found on Trisha Maley, semen and hair that definitively came from the attacker, but it didn't match any of the five accused boys. Not even close. The prosecution knew this. The defense knew this. The jury would eventually know this. So how did this case proceed to trial? How did prosecutors look at five videotaped confessions that contradicted each other, contradicted the crime scene, and contradicted the physical evidence, and decide to move forward? The answer tells you everything you need to know about how the justice system can fail when public pressure and racial bias override facts and evidence. Prosecutors developed a theory. The Central Park Five participated in the attack, but there must have been a sixth attacker. Someone unknown. This mystery assailant was responsible for all the DNA evidence. The five boys simply didn't leave biological evidence behind. Think about how absurd this theory is. In a brutal, prolonged assault involving multiple attackers, five of them managed to not leave a single trace of biological evidence, but a sixth person did. It defies logic and forensic science. But it allowed prosecutors to dismiss the DNA evidence as irrelevant. They could point to the confessions and say, "These boys admitted it. That's all we need." The defense attorneys argued vigorously that the DNA evidence proved their clients were innocent. If the DNA at the scene didn't match any of the accused, and the confessions were coerced and contradictory, what case was left? But remember the climate. New York City in 1989, a white woman brutally attacked five Black and Latino teenagers who had confessed on videotape. The public wanted convictions. The media wanted justice. The police and prosecutors needed a win. Facts became secondary to narrative. As 1989 turned to 1990, the legal machinery ground forward inexorably toward trial. Five families watched their sons being destroyed by a system they believed would protect them. Five teenagers sat in jail cells, knowing they were innocent but powerless against the forces arrayed against them. The confessions existed. The videos had been broadcast on television. The public had already convicted them. And the physical evidence that should have exonerated them was being explained away by prosecutors determined to secure convictions. This was the point of no return. Once the confessions were made, once the arrests were public, once the media narrative was established, the machine couldn't stop. Too many reputations were on the line. Too much political capital had been invested. The NYPD, the district attorney's office, the mayor's office, all had staked their credibility on these being the right suspects. To admit the confessions were false, that the investigation had been flawed, that innocent children had been coerced into confessing to a crime they didn't commit, that would be catastrophic for everyone in power. So they doubled down. They prepared for trial. They refined their theory about the mysterious sixth attacker. They emphasized the confessions and downplayed the evidence. And the five families prepared for a fight they couldn't win. Antron McCray's father, Bobby, would carry guilt for the rest of his life about encouraging his son to cooperate with police. He'd been taught to trust authority, to believe the system worked. He'd sat there as his son gave that videotaped statement, thinking they were helping clear his name. Instead, he participated in his son's destruction. Kevin Richardson's family hired a private investigator, desperate to find evidence that would prove their son's innocence. They couldn't afford expensive lawyers. They mortgaged everything trying to save their child. Yusef Salaam's mother, Sharon, became a fierce advocate, speaking out against the injustice, attending every hearing, refusing to accept that her artistic, gentle son could have committed such violence. She was dismissed as a mother in denial. Raymond Santana's family fractured under the pressure. Relationships broke. The stress of seeing their child branded a monster was unbearable. Korey Wise's family faced the harshest reality. Korey was 16, old enough to be tried and sentenced as an adult. He was facing the most time, in the most dangerous facilities, for a crime he'd only gotten involved in because he wanted to support his friend. As winter 1989 turned to spring 1990, as preparations for trial continued, these five families held on to hope that somehow justice would prevail, that a jury would see the truth. They were about to learn a hard lesson about American justice. The night of April 19, 1989, changed everything for Antron McCray, Kevin Richardson, Yusef Salaam, Raymond Santana, and Korey Wise. But their story was far from over. The truth was out there, waiting to be discovered. It would just take 13 years of stolen life, countless appeals, and one inmate with a conscience to finally bring it to light.
In the first part, we witnessed how 5 innocent teenagers were tortured into false confessions for a brutal crime they didn't commit. We saw how the lack of physical evidence was ignored, how public pressure overwhelmed justice, and how case boys found themselves trapped in a nightmare now. In the second part, we enter the courtroom. This is where the American justice system had its chance to challenge a catastrophic mistake. This is where facts should have triumphed over fear, where evidence should have spoken louder than emotion. But that is not what happened. This is the story of 2 trials, 12 jurors, and 5 guilty verdicts that would sell years from innocent life. The trials began in the summer of tahun 1990, more than a year after the attack on Trisamili. 3 years of waiting had been torture for the families of the accused. The legal teams on both sides had been preparing intensely, but the researchers were vastly unequal. On one side stood the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, led by prosecutor Elizabeth Lederer, one of the Esco's extremist prosecutors. She had unlimited resources, the full backing of the NYPD, forensic experts, and a team of experienced attorneys. She also had something more powerful, public opinion firmly on her side. On the other side were the defense attorneys, some court-appointed. Working with limited budgets and facing the most high-profile case in New York, they had the truth on their side, but truth does not always translate to courtroom victory. The 5 defendants were split into 2 trials. The first trial will prosecute Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, and Raymond Santana together. The second trial will prosecute Kevin Richardson and Korey Wise. The splitting of defendants was strategic. Prosecutors worried that bringing all 5 together makes the jury sympathetic 5 kids seeming like domain for one crime. Separate trials also meant separate opportunities for conviction, and if one trial failed, they called a just strategy for the second. The defense attorneys voted this decision that they argued that treating them separately would prejudice each trial, allowing prosecutors to elicit confessions and statements of defendants not present to defend themselves. They lost this battle. Jury selection was critical and contentious. The defense needed jurors who could look past the horrific nature of the crime and focus on evidence. They needed people who could understand how false confessions happen, who could question authority. To warn the persuaded by racial bias, the prosecution needed the opposite. Jurors who would be horrified with the crime, who would trust police and prosecutors, who would find the videotaped confessions compelling regardless of the lack of physical evidence. Finding impartial jurors in New York City after a year of inflammatory media coverage was nearly impossible. Everyone had heard about the case. Everyone had opinions. The 4-day process questioning potential jurors took weeks. Eventually, 2 juries were rejected, mostly white, middle-aged and older, from Manhattan, but not from Harlem. These were the people who would decide the fate of 5 teenagers from a world very different from their own. On June 25, tahun 1990, the first trial began. Papa is free. Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, and Raymond Santana. The courtroom was packed. Media filled the gallery. The families of the 3 defendants sat on one side, judging as order is handled. On the other side sat supporters of Trisamili. Though Kisha would not testify, she had no memory of the attack. The 3 defendants, now 16 and 17 years old, sat at the defense table in suites that didn't take quite fair, trying to look confident but unable to hide their fear. Cucu Thomas Galligan president. He was known as Tuggebut Fire. Their question was whether fairness could survive the pressure of this case. Elizabeth Lederer stood to deliver the prosecution's opening statement. She was poised, confident, and devastating. She described April 19, tahun 1989, in graphic detail. The attack on Trisamili, the injury, the brutality. She showed crime skin photos that made the jurors gasp and look away. Siapa yang got a picture of Savage villains that demanded justice? Can survive her trump card? The video dapat confessional. You will say this defendants. In their own word, describe what they did. Lederer told the jury, they will tell you how they attacked this woman. How they participated in this crime. Their own words will convict them. She acknowledged the DNA she had on, not allowing the defense to surprise the jury with it later. Yeah, she admitted there was DNA from an unknown male phone on the victim, but this didn't exonerate the defendants. It simply meant there was another participant who hadn't been charged yet. The evidence shows that multiple people attacked Trisha Millen, Lederer argued. These three defendants were part of that group. The confessions prevailed, the injuries prevailed. And the fact that they were in the part needed professionally. It was a masterful opening. CD prepared the jury for the defense as long as argument gained evidence and preemptively defused air. She demanded the confessions the counterfactually minimizing their inconsistent care. She focused on emotion and horror rather than forensic facts. When the defense attorneys sought to deliver their opening statements, they faced an uphill battle. They argued that the confessions were false, churched through hours of interrogation of pregnant children without proper legal representation. They emphasized that none of the confessions matched each other or the physical evidence. They alleged that not a single piece of forensic evidence connected their finger with the crime. If these boys committed this crime, one defense attorney argued, where is the evidence? Where is their DNA? Where are the fibers from their clothing? Where is anything physical that touches them at this crime scene? The answer is, this they exist, because they weren't there, but there's logical arguments struggle to compare with the emotional impact of the prosecution as presentation. The jury had seen those horrible crime scene photos. They heard about a woman left for dead, and they were able to watch video tapes of the defendants confessing. Logic versus emotion. Evidence versus confession. The battling has blurred down over the following weeks. The prosecution built their case witness be witness. Face the picture. They called police officers who testified about finding the defendant in or near Central Park. Case officers described the teenagers as being part of a larger group causing trouble. Some testified about the other crimes committed that nigga, the harassment of the ciclista, the assault on other jogger. Their prosecution was creating guilty association, implying that a young independent nigga was part of a criminal element. They called the doctors who treated Trisha Millen. Katya's testimonies were harrowing. Dr. Robert Kurz described her injuries in clinical detail, skull fractures, brain swelling, catastrophic blood loss, deep He explained that she had been in a coma, that her survival was miraculous, that she would have permanent injuries. The defense voluntarily cross-examined these witnesses. The injuries were real and horrific. Although there was established that nothing in the medical evidence specifically pointed to her Clinton. The prosecution called forensic expert who testified about the crime scene. The evidence collected, the timeline of adventure. Here is where things got interesting. When questioned about the evidence, the forensic experts had to admit none of the defendants' DNA was found on the victim. The semen recovered from Trisha Millen's body and the replicated method an unknown male. Not Antron McCray, not Yusef Salaam, not Raymond Santana, not Kevin Richardson, not Korey Wise, someone else entirely. The prosecution as explanation. The mystery six-attacker theory, they suggested that while these defendants participated in the attack, the sexual assault was committed by someone else who fled before police arrived. The defense hammered this point. How is it possible that 5 people participated in a prolonged violent assault, including striking the victim repeatedly, dragging her into a ravine, removing her clothing, and yet not one of them left lying there in evidence? Not a single hair, not a skin cell, not a game. The forensic expert had no good answer. They could only say that DNA transfer due to hours of truth, which is technically true but statistically uniquely not tremendous violent. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for, the videotaped confessions. The courtroom fell as the first tape began to play. Here was Antron McCray, 15 years old, sitting next to his father, telling the story prosecutor wanted to her. What Cinta's tapos today? With everything what no? They clearly false confession. The boys are exhausted, confused, looking to authority figures for approval. Their stories don't match each other. They get basic facts wrong. They telling police what they think they want to hear. Butuh tet juri in tahun 1990, we could the context of false confession researcher. We could understand how interrogations can produce false admissions. These papers were damning. They saw Canadians admit them to being present at an attack. They heard descriptions of violence, even if the details were wrong. They were checked as human implicate themselves, and the jury believed what they were saying. Guir. The prosecution rested their case after 2 weeks. They presented the confession, explained away the damning evidence, and created a narrative of group violence that resulted in a near death for an innocent woman. No, it was the defense aspirant.
The defense strategy was clear: discredit the confessions and emphasize the lack of physical evidence. They called expert witnesses on false confessions. Dr. Richard Offsch, a leading authority on coercive interrogation techniques, testified about how innocent people can be pressured into confessing to crimes they didn't commit. He explained the techniques used by the NYPD: prolonged isolation, lies about evidence, promises of leniency, suggestion of details. He walked the jury through each confession, pointing out the hallmarks of false statements, the inconsistencies, the factual errors, the way the boys seemed to be guessing rather than remembering. He noted how their descriptions didn't match the crime scene, the victim's injuries, or each other's accounts. These are textbook false confessions, Dr. Offsch testified. When you have multiple suspects telling different stories that don't align with physical evidence, when you have interrogations lasting many hours with vulnerable juveniles, when you have police feeding information to suspects, this is how false confessions are created. It was powerful testimony, but the prosecution's cross-examination was effective. They got Dr. Offsch to admit he hadn't been present for the interrogations. They suggested he was a hired gun who testified for defense attorneys regularly. They asked him, so these boys just happened to all falsely confess to the same crime on the same night? The defense called character witnesses, teachers, neighbors, family members who testified that these were good kids, not violent criminals. Antron's father tearfully described his son as gentle and obedient. Raymond's grandmother spoke about his kindness. Yusef's mother talked about his poetry and dreams. These witnesses humanized the defendants, but character evidence rarely overcomes confession evidence. The prosecution's cross-examination was brutal. You didn't know what he was doing in Central Park that night, did you? You can't say for certain he didn't participate in this attack, can you? The defense wanted to call the defendants themselves to testify. This was risky. Putting them on the stand would allow the prosecution to cross-examine them, to make them relive those interrogations, to try to catch them in contradictions. Yusef Salaam chose to testify. At 16, he took the stand and told his story. He described being picked up by police, questioned for hours, told his friends had already confessed, and implicated him. He explained how exhausted and scared he'd been, how he didn't understand his rights, how detectives had fed him information. I didn't hurt that woman, Yusef testified, his voice steady despite his fear. I was in the park, but I didn't do this. They told me if I said I was there, I could go home. They told me they already knew what happened. They just needed me to confirm it. I was 15 years old, and I was terrified. His testimony was compelling, but the prosecution's cross-examination was devastating. Elizabeth Lederer confronted him with every statement he'd made to police. She suggested he was lying now to save himself. She pointed out that he'd been caught in lies before, small inconsistencies in his initial statements to police. So you lied then, or you're lying now? Lederer asked. Which is it? It was an impossible position. Yusef tried to explain the nuance, that he said things under pressure that weren't true, that false confessions aren't the same as voluntary lies. But to a jury the question seemed simple. Either he was lying to police or lying to them now. Antron and Raymond chose not to testify. Their attorneys advised that the risk was too great. The prosecution could use their presence in the park, their association with other kids who'd committed crimes that night, and their videotaped statements to destroy them on cross-examination. It was a devastating decision. Not testifying allowed the prosecution to argue they were hiding something. But testifying might have been worse. After weeks of testimony, Both sides prepared their closing arguments. This was the last chance to sway the jury. Elizabeth Lederer's closing was a tour de force of prosecution rhetoric. She began by reminding the jury of Tricia Mailey's injuries, showing the photos again, forcing them to confront the horror of what happened. "This woman was nearly killed," Lederer said, her voice rising with emotion. "She was beaten, raped, and left to die in the mud. Someone did this to her, and these defendants have confessed to being part of it." She walked through each confession, playing key clips from the videos. She argued that while the details varied, the core fact remained the same. All three admitted to being present and participating in the attack. Why would they confess if they were innocent? Lederer asked the jury. These weren't 5-minute interrogations. These boys had time to think, time to consult with parents in some cases, time to understand what they were saying. They confessed because they were guilty. She addressed the DNA evidence directly. "The defense wants you to believe that because we have identified every participant, these defendants must be innocent. That's not how it works. Crimes can have multiple perpetrators. The fact that one attacker hasn't been caught doesn't mean these defendants are innocent. Their own words convict them." She concluded powerfully. "You have seen the evidence. You have heard their confessions. You know what happened in Central Park that night. These defendants participated in a brutal attack on an innocent woman. They may not have been the only ones, but they were there, and they are guilty. Give Tricia Mailey justice. Find them guilty." The defense closing arguments fought against this tide. They hammered the lack of physical evidence. They explained false confessions. They pointed out every inconsistency, every impossibility in the prosecution's case. "Where is the evidence?" one defense attorney asked. "Not the confessions that were coerced from frightened children. Not the testimony about other crimes committed by other people. The actual evidence that these 3 boys attacked Tricia Mailey. Show me one piece of forensic evidence. One hair, one fiber, one drop of blood, one fingerprint. It doesn't exist." They reminded the jury that the DNA evidence pointed to someone else entirely. The prosecution wants you to believe in a mystery 6th attacker. But the simpler explanation is the truth. The person whose DNA was found at the scene is the person who committed this crime. And it wasn't any of these defendants. They talked about reasonable doubt. You don't have to prove they're innocent. The prosecution has to prove they're guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And when there's no physical evidence, when the confessions are contradictory and coerced, when the forensic science points away from the defendants, that's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's doubt, period. These were strong arguments, based on facts and evidence. But facts and evidence were competing with emotion and fear, with videotaped confessions and public pressure. The jury deliberated for 10 days. 10 long days while the defendants waited in jail, while families prayed, while the media speculated. Inside the jury room, we now know there was significant debate. Some jurors had doubts. The lack of physical evidence troubled them. The inconsistencies in the confessions were hard to ignore. But other jurors focused on the confessions themselves. Why would they say they did it if they didn't? This question, which seems simple but ignores the reality of false confessions, swayed the undecided. The jury sent notes to the judge asking for clarification on various points of law. They reviewed evidence. They watched the confession tapes again. And slowly, the holdouts were convinced. Not necessarily because they were certain of guilt, but because the confessions seemed like such strong evidence. In 1990, before false confession research became widely known, before DNA exonerations became common, the idea that multiple teenagers would all falsely confess seemed impossible. On August 18, 1990, the jury reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The families of the 3 defendants held hands, praying for acquittal but fearing the worst. The media had their cameras ready. The defendants were brought in. Antron McCray, now 17. Yusef Salaam, 16. Raymond Santana, 16. They tried to look confident, but their fear was palpable. Judge Galligan asked the jury foreman if they'd reached a verdict. The foreman stood and said yes. The verdicts were read one by one, count by count. Each defendant faced multiple charges: assault, rape, riot, robbery, attempted murder. For Antron McCray, on the count of assault in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of rape in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty. Antron's mother screamed. His father buried his face in his hands. Antron himself seemed to collapse inward. all hope draining from his face. For Yusef Salaam, on the count of assault in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of rape in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty. Yusef's mother, Sharon, stood and shouted, "This is not justice. These are innocent children." She had to be restrained by court officers. Yusef stood motionless, tears streaming down his face. For Raymond Santana, on the count of assault in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty. On the count of rape in the first degree, how do you find? Guilty. Raymond's family members sobbed openly. Raymond himself seemed unable to process what was happening, looking around the courtroom as if searching for someone to tell him this wasn't real. Not all counts came back guilty. Some of the robbery and riot charges resulted in acquittals, but on the major charges related to the attack on Trisha Meili, all three were convicted. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Families crying, supporters shouting, media scrambling to file reports. The defendants were immediately taken into custody to await sentencing. Outside the courthouse, prosecutors declared victory. Elizabeth Lederer told reporters, "Justice has been served. These individuals have been held accountable for a terrible crime." Defense attorneys spoke of appeal, of continuing to fight, but their words rang hollow in the face of the verdicts. The families were destroyed. These boys, and they were still boys, had been convicted of one of the most notorious crimes in New York history. They were facing years, possibly decades, in prison, and they were innocent. Just weeks later, the second trial began. Peoples v. Kevin Richardson and Korey Wise. Kevin was now 15. Korey was 17. They sat at the defense table, having watched the first trial result in convictions, knowing they faced the same fate. The prosecution's strategy was identical. Present the confessions, explain away the DNA evidence, rely on the horror of the crime to motivate conviction. The defense fought with the same arguments: false confessions, no physical evidence, reasonable doubt. But there was one crucial difference in this trial. Korey Wise's confession was even more obviously false than the others. Korey had learning disabilities that made him particularly vulnerable to suggestion and manipulation. His videotaped confession showed him struggling to answer questions, frequently saying, "I don't know," contradicting himself multiple times within the same interview. At one point in his confession, Korey described hitting the victim with a brick. The problem? There was no brick at the crime scene. The victim was hit with a rock. This factual impossibility should have been proof that Korey was guessing, making up details, trying to please his interrogators. But the prosecution argued that Korey was simply mistaken about the weapon, that the core of his confession remained true. The defense brought in additional expert testimony about Korey's intellectual disabilities and how they made him especially susceptible to coercive interrogation techniques. They showed how detectives had fed him information, how he'd repeatedly changed his story when told he was wrong. Korey Wise wasn't confessing to a crime he committed, his attorney argued. He was trying to figure out what the police wanted him to say so he could go home. That's not a confession. That's a young man with learning disabilities being manipulated by experienced interrogators. Kevin Richardson's case was slightly stronger in terms of physical evidence, or rather, the complete lack thereof. Kevin was smaller, younger looking than the others. His videotaped confession showed a terrified child telling a story that made no sense and contradicted all the other confessions. But again, the confession's mere existence was treated as proof of guilt. The second trial lasted several weeks. The jury deliberated for 11 days, even longer than the first jury. There were clear indications that some jurors had serious doubts. But on December 11, 1990, the verdict came back: guilty. Both Kevin Richardson and Korey Wise were convicted on multiple counts of assault, rape, and robbery. Kevin's mother collapsed in the courtroom. Kevin himself, just 15 years old, wept openly. Korey Wise showed less emotion. Perhaps he'd already resigned himself to this outcome after watching the first trial. 5 trials, 5 convictions, 5 innocent teenagers now convicted criminals. The sentencing hearings took place in early 1991. This was the moment when the judge would decide how many years these young men would spend behind bars. Because they were juveniles, even Korey, who was being sentenced as an adult on some counts, the sentences couldn't be as harsh as they might have been for adult defendants. But they were still devastating. Antron McCray was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. Yusef Salaam was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. Raymond Santana was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. Kevin Richardson was sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. Korey Wise, because he was 16 at the time of the alleged crime and tried as an adult on some counts, received the harshest sentence, 5 to 15 years in prison. At the sentencing hearings, the defendants and their families had the opportunity to speak. These statements were heartbreaking. Yusef Salaam, always articulate, addressed the court. "I didn't do this crime. I have maintained my innocence from the beginning. I understand that the jury didn't believe me, but that doesn't change the truth. I am innocent, and someday that truth will come out. I forgive the people who did this to me, but I will never stop fighting to clear my name." Antron McCray's father, Bobby, spoke through tears. "I thought I was doing the right thing, cooperating with the police. I thought the truth would protect my son. I will never forgive myself for what happened. My boy is innocent, and this system has destroyed him." Raymond Santana's grandmother addressed the judge. "This child is not a rapist. This child is not violent. You are sending an innocent boy to prison, and you will have to answer for that to God." Korey Wise, struggling to express himself but determined to be heard, said simply, "I didn't do nothing. I just wanted to help my friend. I didn't do nothing wrong." The judge, bound by the jury's verdicts, imposed the sentences. He acknowledged that these were young men with their lives ahead of them, but he also noted the severity of the crime and the need for accountability. What he didn't acknowledge, what he couldn't acknowledge without overturning the verdicts, was that these young men were innocent. As the defendants were led away to begin their sentences, their families sat in the courtroom, stunned. Years of their children's lives had just been stolen. Childhoods ended. Futures destroyed. The media covered the sentencing with satisfaction. Justice had been served. The Central Park jogger had her day in court. The wolf pack was behind bars. But in the cells where these 5 young men were held, there was only despair and the knowledge that the truth, their innocence, meant nothing in the face of a system determined to convict them. And so, in early 1991, 5 innocent teenagers entered the prison system as convicted rapists. Antron McCray, who'd cooperated with police because his father told him to trust the system. Kevin Richardson, who'd gone to the precinct with his mother thinking they'd clear up a misunderstanding. Yusef Salaam, who'd refused to sign a written confession but was convicted anyway. Raymond Santana, whose father had called the police to clear his son's name. Korey Wise, who'd only been at the police station to support a friend and ended up with the longest sentence. The trials were over. The convictions were secured. The media moved on to other stories. The public believed justice had been served. But the truth remained unchanged. These 5 were innocent. They would spend years behind bars, years of their youth, their education, their development stolen from them. They would face violence in prison. They would miss graduations, relationships, opportunities. They would be labeled as rapists and attackers, registered as sex offenders, forever branded by a crime they didn't commit. Their families would visit them behind glass, would watch their children grow up in cages, would fight hopeless appeals that went nowhere. The real attacker remained free, his identity unknown, his DNA sitting in evidence storage, waiting for technology and circumstance to finally reveal the truth. But that revelation would take years. Over a decade of wrongful imprisonment. Over a decade of stolen life. The justice system had spoken. The juries had decided. The sentences had been imposed. And 5 innocent young men paid the price for a rush to judgment, for coerced confessions, for a city's need for vengeance, and for a justice system that valued convictions over truth. This is where the darkest chapter of their story begins. But remember, this is also where their resilience, their determination to prove their innocence, and their refusal to be broken truly begins. In the next part, we'll follow them into prison. We'll see how they survived. We'll witness the appeals that went nowhere and the hope that never quite died. And we'll discover how, against all odds, the truth finally emerged and changed everything. Because this story isn't over. Not by a long shot. For the Central Park 5, prison life was nothing short of a nightmare. Each of them was still a child when they were sent to adult correctional facilities. They had gone from classrooms and basketball courts to concrete walls and razor wire. Inside, they were treated like monsters. Other inmates targeted them. Guards viewed them with hostility, and the media's portrayal of them as violent predators followed them everywhere. For Korey Wise, who was 16 at the time and tried as an adult, things were even worse. He was sent to Rikers Island, one of the toughest prisons in America. Every day was about survival. Korey spent long stretches in solitary confinement, not because he wanted to, but because it was the only place he felt safe. He was beaten multiple times and often moved from one facility to another to escape attacks. Still, through the darkness, he held on to hope, a fragile belief that one day the truth would come out. The others, sent to juvenile facilities, faced their own share of pain. Letters from home became their lifeline. They grew up behind bars, learning how to adapt, how to fight, and how to stay alive in a world that saw them as guilty long before any evidence could prove otherwise. Years passed, slowly and brutally. They missed birthdays, graduations, and the simple milestones of youth. Each of them served between 6 and 13 years, all for a crime they didn't commit. But even as their childhood slipped away, the truth was out there, waiting to surface. After more than a decade behind bars, everything changed because of a single encounter. In 2002, a man named Matias Reyes, already serving a life sentence for murder and multiple rapes, confessed that he alone had attacked the jogger in Central Park that night in 1989. At first, no one believed him. The case was too infamous, too tangled in years of public outrage. But when investigators decided to test the DNA evidence again, the results were undeniable. Reyes' DNA was a perfect match. None of the 5 boys, now men, had any genetic connection to the crime. Every confession they had given years earlier had been coerced, recorded after hours of intense interrogation without lawyers or parents present. The truth hit New York like a thunderclap. These 5 young men had spent years in prison for something they never did. Their names had been dragged through headlines, their faces vilified, their lives stolen, all because of a rush to judgment. In December 2002, the convictions of the Central Park 5 were vacated. They walked free, but freedom didn't erase what had happened. They returned to a city that had once turned its back on them, trying to rebuild lives from the ashes of their youth. Korey Wise, who had served the longest sentence, received the news while still behind bars. He wept, not just for himself, but for the boys who had grown into men inside prison walls. The truth had finally surfaced, but the damage was already done. Years later, the city of New York settled a lawsuit with the 5 men for over $40 million, not as a reward, but as a recognition of the injustice they endured. Today, they are known not as the Central Park 5, but as the Exonerated Five. And their story stands as one of the most powerful reminders of what happens when fear, race, and pressure collide inside a justice system that is supposed to protect.